Chapters 53 and 54 of The Portrait of a Lady by Henry James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 53. It was not with surprise, it was with a feeling which in other circumstances would have had much of the effect of joy, that as Isabel descended from the Paris mail at Charing Cross, she stepped into the arms, as it were, or at any rate into the hands, of Henrietta Stackpole. She had telegraphed to her friend from Turin, and though she had not definitely said to herself that Henrietta would meet her, she had felt her telegram would produce some helpful result. On her long journey from Rome her mind had been given up to vagueness. She was unable to question the future. She performed this journey with sightless eyes, and took little pleasure in the countries she traversed, decked out though they were in the richest freshness of spring. Her thoughts followed their course through other countries, strange-looking, dimly lighted, pathless lands, in which there was no change of seasons, but only, as it seemed, a perpetual dreariness of winter. She had plenty to think about, but it was neither reflection nor conscious purpose that filled her mind. Disconnected visions passed through it, and sudden gleams of memory, of expectation. The past and the future came and went at their will, but she saw them only in fitful images, which rose and fell by a logic of their own. It was extraordinary, the things she remembered. Now that she was in the secret, now that she knew something that so much concerned her, and the eclipse of which had made life resemble an attempt to play whist with an imperfect pack of cards, the truth of things, their mutual relations, their meaning, and for the most part their horror, rose before her with a kind of architectural vastness. She remembered 1,000 trifles. They started to life with the spontaneity of a shiver. She had thought them trifles at the time. Now she saw that they had been weighted with lead. Yet even now they were trifles after all, for of what use was it to her to understand them? Nothing seemed of use to her today. All purpose, all intention was suspended, all desire too, save the single desire to reach her much-embracing refuge. Gardencourt had been her starting point, and to those muffled chambers it was at least a temporary solution to return. She had gone forth in her strength, she would come back in her weakness, and if the place had been a rest to her before, it would be a sanctuary now. She envied Ralph his dying, for if one were thinking of rest, that was the most perfect of all. To cease utterly, to give it all up, and not know anything more. This idea was as sweet as the vision of a cool bath in a marble tank, in a darkened chamber, in a hot land. She had moments indeed in her journey from Rome, which were almost as good as being dead. She sat in her corner, so motionless, so passive, simply with the sense of being carried, so detached from hope and regret, that she recalled to herself one of those Etruscan figures couched upon the receptacle of their ashes. There was nothing to regret now. That was all over. Not only the time of her folly, but the time of her repentance was far. The only thing to regret was that Madame Merle had been so unimaginable. Just here her intelligence dropped, from literal inability to say what it was that Madame Merle had been. Whatever it was for Madame Merle herself to regret it, and doubtless she would do so in America, where she had announced she was going. It concerned Isabel no more. She only had an impression that she should never again see Madame Merle. This impression carried her into the future, of which from time to time she had a mutilated glimpse. She saw herself in the distant years, still in the attitude of a woman who had her life to live, and these intimations contradicted the spirit of the present hour. It might be desirable to get away, really away, further away than little grey-green England, but this privilege was evidently to be denied her. Deep in her soul, deeper than any appetite for renunciation, was the sense that life would be her business for a long time to come. and at moments there was something inspiring, almost enlivening in the conviction. It was a proof of strength. It was a proof she should some day be happy again. It couldn't be she was to live only to suffer. She was still young, after all, and a great many things might happen to her yet. To live only to suffer, only to feel the injury of life repeated and enlarged, it seemed to her she was too valuable, too capable for that. Then she wondered if it were vain and stupid to think so well of herself. When had it ever been a guarantee to be valuable? Wasn't all history full of the destruction of precious things? Wasn't it much more probable that if one were fine, one would suffer? It involved, then, perhaps an admission that one had a certain grossness. But Isabel recognized, as it passed before her eyes, the quick, vague shadow of a long future. She should never escape. She should last to the end. Then the middle years wrapped her about again, and the grey curtain of her indifference closed her in. Henrietta kissed her, as Henrietta usually kissed, as if she were afraid she should be caught doing it. And then Isabel stood there in the crowd, looking about her, looking for her servant. She asked nothing. She wished to wait. She had a sudden perception that she should be helped. She rejoiced Henrietta had come. There was something terrible in an arrival in London. The dusky, smoky, far-arching vault of the station, the strange livid light, the dense, dark, pushing crowd filled her with a nervous fear, and made her put her arm into her friend's. She remembered she had once liked these things. They seemed part of a mighty spectacle in which there was something that touched her. She remembered how she walked away from Euston in the winter dusk in the crowded streets 5 years before. She could not have done that today, and the incident came before her as the deed of another person. "It's too beautiful that you should have come," said Henrietta, looking at her as if she thought Isabel might be prepared to challenge the proposition. If you hadn't, well, I don't know," remarked Miss Stackpole, hinting ominously at her powers of disapproval. Isabel looked about without seeing her maid. Her eyes rested on another figure, however, which she felt she had seen before, and in a moment she recognized the genial countenance of Mr. Bantling. He stood a little apart, and it was not in the power of the multitude that pressed about him to make him yield an inch of the ground he had taken, that of abstracting himself discreetly while the two ladies performed their embraces. "There's Mr. Bantling," said Isabel, gently, irrelevantly, scarcely caring much now whether she should find her maid or not. "Oh, yes, he goes everywhere with me. Come here, Mr. Bantling," Henrietta exclaimed, whereupon the gallant bachelor advanced with a smile tempered, however, by the gravity of the occasion. "Isn't it lovely she has come?" Henrietta asked. "He knows all about it," she added. "We had quite a discussion. He said you wouldn't. I said you would." "I thought you always agreed," Isabel smiled in return. She felt she could smile now. She had seen in an instant, in Mr. Bantling's brave eyes, that he had good news for her. They seemed to say he wished her to remember he was an old friend of her cousin, that he understood that it was all right. Isabel gave him her hand. She thought of him, extravagantly, as a beautiful, blameless knight. "Oh, I always agree," said Mr. Bantling, "but she doesn't, you know." "Didn't I tell you that a maid was a nuisance?" Henrietta inquired. "Your young lady has probably remained at Calais." "I don't care," said Isabel, looking at Mr. Bantling, whom she had never found so interesting. "Stay with her while I go and see," Henrietta commanded, leaving the two for a moment together. They stood there at first in silence, and then Mr. Bantling asked Isabel how it had been on the Channel. "Very fine. No, I believe it was very rough," she said, to her companion's obvious surprise. After which she added, "You've been to Gardencourt, I know." "Now, how do you know that?" "I can't tell you, except you look like a person who has been to Gardencourt." Do you think I look awfully sad? It's awfully sad there, you know." "I don't believe you ever look awfully sad. You look awfully kind," said Isabel, with a breadth that cost her no effort. It seemed to her she should never again feel a superficial embarrassment. Poor Mr. Bantling, however, was still in this inferior stage. He blushed a good deal and laughed. He assured her that he was often very blue, and that when he was blue he was awfully fierce. "You can ask Miss Stackpole, you know. I was at Gardencourt 2 days ago." "Did you see my cousin?" "Only for a little. But he had been seeing people. Warburton had been there the day before. Ralph was just the same as usual, except that he was in bed, and that he looks tremendously ill, and that he can't speak," Mr. Bantling pursued. "He was awfully jolly and funny all the same. He was just as clever as ever. It's awfully wretched." Even in the crowded, noisy station this simple picture was vivid. "Was that late in the day?" "Yes, I went on purpose. We thought you'd like to know." "I'm greatly obliged to you. Can I go down to-night?" "Ah, I don't think she'll let you go," said Mr. Bantling. "She wants you to stop with her. I made Touchett's man promise to telegraph me to-day, and I found the telegram an hour ago at my club. 'Quiet and easy,' that's what it says, and it's dated 2 o'clock. So you can see you can wait till to-morrow. You must be awfully tired." "Yes, I'm awfully tired. And I thank you again." "Oh," said Mr. Bantling, "we were certain you would like the last news." On which Isabel vaguely noted that he and Henrietta seemed after all to agree. Miss Stackpole came back with Isabel's maid, whom she had caught in the act of proving her utility. This excellent person, instead of losing herself in the crowd, had simply attended to her mistress's luggage, so that the latter was now at liberty to leave the station. "You know you're not to think of going to the country to-night," Henrietta remarked to her. "It doesn't matter whether there's a train or not. You're to come straight to me in Wimpole Street. There isn't a corner to be had in London, but I've got you one all the same. It isn't a Roman palace, but it will do for a night." "I'll do whatever you wish," Isabel said. "You'll come and answer a few questions. That's what I wish." "She doesn't say anything about dinner, does she, Mrs. Osmond?" Mr. Bantling inquired jocosely. Henrietta fixed him a moment with her speculative gaze. "I see you're in a great hurry to get your own. You'll be at Paddington Station to-morrow morning at 10." "Don't come for my sake, Mr. Bantling," said Isabel. "He'll come for mine," Henrietta declared, as she ushered her friend into a cab. And later, in a large dusky parlour in Wimpole Street, to do her justice there had been dinner enough, she asked those questions to which she had alluded at the station. "Did your husband make you a scene about your coming?" That was Miss Stackpole's first inquiry. "No, I can't say he made a scene." "He didn't object, then?" "Yes, he objected very much. But it was not what you'd call a scene." "What was it, then?" "It was a very quiet conversation." Henrietta for a moment regarded her guest. "It must have been hellish," she then remarked. And Isabel didn't deny that it had been hellish. But she confined herself to answering Henrietta's questions, which was easy, as they were tolerably definite. For the present she offered her no new information. "Well," said Miss Stackpole at last, "I've only one criticism to make. I don't see why you promised little Miss Osmond to go back." "I'm not sure I myself see now," Isabel replied, "but I did then." "If you've forgotten your reason, perhaps you won't return." Isabel waited a moment. "Perhaps I shall find another." "You'll certainly never find a good one." "In default of a better, my having promised will do," Isabel suggested. "Yes, that's why I hate it." "Don't speak of it now. I've a little time. Coming away was a complication, but what will going back be?" "You must remember, after all, that he won't make you a scene," said Henrietta with much intention. "He will, though," Isabel answered gravely. It won't be the scene of a moment, it will be a scene of the rest of my life." For some minutes the two women sat and considered this remainder, and then Miss Stackpole, to change the subject, as Isabel had requested, announced abruptly, "I've been to stay with Lady Pensel." "Ah, the invitation came at last." "Yes, it took 5 years, but this time she wanted to see me." "Naturally enough." "It was more natural than I think you know," said Henrietta, who fixed her eyes on a distant point. And then she added, turning suddenly, "Isabel Archer, I beg your pardon. You don't know why? Because I criticized you, and yet I've gone further than you. Mr. Osmond, at least, was born on the other side." It was a moment before Isabel grasped her meaning. This sense was so modestly, or at least so ingeniously veiled. Isabel's mind was not possessed at present with the comicality of things, but she greeted with a quick laugh the image that her companion had raised. She immediately recovered herself, however, and with the right excess of intensity. "Henrietta Stackpole," she asked, "are you going to give up your country?" "Yes, my poor Isabel, I am. I won't pretend to deny it. I look the fact in the face. I'm going to marry Mr. Bantling and locate right here in London." "It seems very strange," said Isabel, smiling now. "Well, yes, I suppose it does. I've come to it little by little. I think I know what I'm doing, but I don't know as I can explain." "One can't explain one's marriage," Isabel answered, "and yours doesn't need to be explained. Mr. Bantling isn't a riddle." "No, he isn't a bad pun, or even a high flight of American humour. He has a beautiful nature," Henrietta went on. "I've studied him for many years, and I see right through him. He's as clear as the style of a good prospectus. He's not intellectual, but he appreciates intellect. On the other hand, he doesn't exaggerate its claims. I sometimes think we do in the United States." "Ah," said Isabel, "you're changed indeed. It's the first time I've ever heard you say anything against your native land." "I only say that we're too infatuated with mere brain power. That, after all, isn't a vulgar fault. But I am changed. A woman has to change a good deal to marry." "I hope you'll be very happy. You will at last, over here, see something of the inner life." Henrietta gave a little significant sigh. "That's the key to the mystery, I believe. I couldn't endure to be kept off. Now I've as good a right as any one," she added with artless elation. Isabel was duly diverted, but there was a certain melancholy in her view. Henrietta, after all, had confessed herself human and feminine. Henrietta, whom she had hitherto regarded as a light, keen flame, a disembodied voice. It was a disappointment to find she had personal susceptibilities, that she was subject to common passions, and that her intimacy with Mr. Bantling had not been completely original. There was a want of originality in her marrying him. There was even a kind of stupidity, and for a moment, to Isabel's sense, the dreariness of the world took on a deeper tinge. A little later, indeed, she reflected that Mr. Bantling himself at least was original. But she didn't see how Henrietta could give up her country. She herself had relaxed her hold of it, but it had never been her country as it had been Henrietta's. She presently asked her if she had enjoyed her visit to Lady Pensel. "Oh yes," said Henrietta. "She didn't know what to make of me." "And was that very enjoyable?" "Very much so, because she's supposed to be a master mind. She thinks she knows everything, but she doesn't understand a woman of my modern type. It would be so much easier for her if I were only a little better or a little worse. She's so puzzled. I believe she thinks it's my duty to go and do something immoral. She thinks it's immoral that I should marry her brother, but, after all, that isn't immoral enough. And she'll never understand my mixture, never." "She's not so intelligent as her brother, then," said Isabel. "He appears to have understood." "Oh no, he hasn't!" cried Miss Stackpole with decision. "I really believe that's what he wants to marry me for, just to find out the mystery and the proportions of it. That's a fixed idea, a kind of fascination." "It's very good of you to humour it." "Oh, well," said Henrietta, "I've something to find out too." And Isabel saw that she had not renounced an allegiance, but planned an attack. She was at last about to grapple in earnest with England. Isabel also perceived, however, on the morrow, at the Paddington Station, where she found herself at 10 o'clock, in the company both of Miss Stackpole and Mr. Bantling, that the gentleman bore his perplexities lightly. If he had not found out everything, he had found out at least the great point, that Miss Stackpole would not be wanting in initiative. It was evident in the selection of a wife he had been on his guard against this deficiency. "Henrietta has told me, and I'm very glad," Isabel said, as she gave him her hand. "I daresay you think it awfully odd," Mr. Bantling replied, resting on his neat umbrella. "Yes, I think it awfully odd." "You can't think it so awfully odd as I do. But I've always rather liked striking out a line," said Mr. Bantling serenely. Chapter 54. Isabel's arrival at Gardencourt on this second occasion was even quieter than it had been on the first. Ralph Touchett kept but a small household, and to the new servants Mrs. Osmond was a stranger, so that instead of being conducted to her own apartment she was coldly shown into the drawing-room and left to wait while her name was carried up to her aunt. She waited a long time. Mrs. Touchett appeared in no hurry to come to her. She grew impatient at last. She grew nervous and scared, as scared as if the objects about her had begun to show for conscious things, watching her trouble with grotesque grimaces. The day was dark and cold. The dusk was thick in the corners of the wide brown rooms. The house was perfectly still, with a stillness that Isabel remembered. It had filled all the place for days before the death of her uncle. She left the drawing-room and wandered about, strolled into the library and along the gallery of pictures, where, in the deep silence, her footstep made an echo. Nothing was changed. She recognized everything she had seen years before. It might have been only yesterday she had stood there. She envied the security of valuable pieces, which change by no hair's breadth, only grow in value, while their owners lose inch by inch youth, happiness, beauty. And she became aware that she was walking about as her aunt had done on the day she had come to see her in Albany. She was changed enough since then. That had been the beginning. It suddenly struck her that if her Aunt Lydia had not come that day in just that way and found her alone, everything might have been different. She might have had another life. She might have been a woman more blessed. She stopped in the gallery in front of a small picture, a charming and precious Bonington, upon which her eyes rested a long time. But she was not looking at the picture. She was wondering whether, if her aunt had not come that day in Albany, she would have married Caspar Goodwood. Mrs. Touchett appeared at last, just after Isabel had returned to the big, uninhabited drawing-room. She looked a good deal older, but her eye was as bright as ever, and her head as erect. Her thin lips seemed a repository of latent meanings. She wore a little grey dress of the most undecorated fashion, and Isabel wondered, as she had wondered the first time, if her remarkable kinswoman resembled more a queen regent or the matron of a jail. Her lips felt very thin indeed on Isabel's hot cheek. "I've kept you waiting, because I've been sitting with Ralph," Mrs. Touchett said. The nurse had gone to luncheon, and I had taken her place. "He has a man who's supposed to look after him, but the man's good for nothing. He's always looking out of the window, as if there were anything to see. I didn't wish to move, because Ralph seemed to be sleeping, and I was afraid the sound would disturb him. I waited till the nurse came back. I remembered you knew the house." "I find I know it better even than I thought. "I've been walking everywhere," Isabel answered. And then she asked if Ralph slept much. "He lies with his eyes closed. He doesn't move. But I'm not sure that it's always sleep." "Will he see me? Can he speak to me?" Mrs. Touchett declined the office of saying. You can try him was the limit of her extravagance. And then she offered to conduct Isabel to her room. "I thought they had taken you there, but it's not my house, it's Ralph's, and I don't know what they do. They must at least have taken your luggage. I don't suppose you brought much. Not that I care, however. I believe they've given you the same room you had before. When Ralph heard you were coming, he said you must have that one." "Did he say anything else?" "Ah, my dear, he doesn't chatter as he used," cried Mrs. Touchett, as she preceded her niece up the staircase. It was the same room, and something told Isabel it had not been slept in since she occupied it. Her luggage was there, and was not voluminous. Mrs. Touchett sat down a moment with her eyes upon it. "Is there really no hope?" our young woman asked as she stood before her. "None whatever. There never has been. It has not been a successful life." "No, it has only been a beautiful one." Isabel found herself already contradicting her aunt. She was irritated by her dryness. "I don't know what you mean by that. There's no beauty without health. That is a very odd dress to travel in." Isabel glanced at her garment. "I left Rome at an hour's notice. I took the first that came." "Your sisters in America wish to know how you dress. That seemed to be their principal interest. I wasn't able to tell them, but they seem to have the right idea, that you never wear anything less than black brocade." "They think I'm more brilliant than I am. I'm afraid to tell them the truth," said Isabel. "Lily wrote me you had dined with her." "She invited me 4 times, and I went once. After the second time she should have let me alone. The dinner was very good. It must have been expensive. Her husband has a very bad manner. Did I enjoy my visit to America? Why should I have enjoyed it? I didn't go for my pleasure." These were interesting items, but Mrs. Touchett soon left her niece, whom she was to meet in half an hour at the midday meal. For this repast the two ladies faced each other at an abbreviated table in the melancholy dining-room. Here, after a little, Isabel saw her aunt not to be so dry as she appeared, and her old pity for the poor woman's inexpressiveness, her want of regret, of disappointment, came back to her. Unmistakably she would have found it a blessing to-day to be able to feel a defeat, a mistake, even a shame or two. She wondered if she were not even missing those enrichments of consciousness, and privately trying, reaching out for some aftertaste of life, dregs of the banquet, the testimony of pain, or the cold recreation of remorse. On the other hand, perhaps she was afraid. If she should begin to know remorse at all, it might take her too far. Isabel could perceive, however, how it had come over her dimly that she had failed of something, that she saw herself in the future as an old woman without memories. Her little sharp face looked tragical. She told her niece that Ralph had as yet not moved, but that he probably would be able to see her before dinner. And then in a moment she added that he had seen Lord Warburton the day before, an announcement which startled Isabel a little, as it seemed an intimation that this personage was in the neighbourhood, and that an accident might bring them together. Such an accident would not be happy. She had not come to England to struggle again with Lord Warburton. She none the less presently said to her aunt that he had been very kind to Ralph. She had seen something of that in Rome. "He has something else to think of now," Mrs. Touchett returned, and she paused with a gaze like a gimlet. Isabel saw she meant something, and instantly guessed what she meant. But her reply concealed her guess. Her heart beat faster, and she wished to gain a moment. "Ah, yes, the House of Lords and all that." "He's not thinking of the Lords, he's thinking of the ladies. At least he's thinking of one of them. He told Ralph he's engaged to be married." "Ah, to be married!" Isabel mildly exclaimed. "Unless he breaks it off. He seemed to think Ralph would like to know. Poor Ralph can't go to the wedding, though I believe it's to take place very soon." "And who's the young lady?" "A member of the aristocracy. Lady Flora, Lady Felicia, something of that sort." "I'm very glad," Isabel said. "It must be a sudden decision." "Sudden enough, I believe. A courtship of 3 weeks. It has only just been made public." "I'm very glad," Isabel repeated, with a larger emphasis. She knew her aunt was watching her, looking for the signs of some imputed soreness, and the desire to prevent her companion from seeing anything of this kind enabled her to speak in the tone of quick satisfaction, the tone almost of relief. Mrs. Touchett, of course, followed the tradition that ladies, even married ones, regard the marriage of their old lovers as an offence to themselves. Isabel's first care, therefore, was to show that however that might be in general, she was not offended now. But meanwhile, as I say, her heart beat faster, and if she sat for some moments thoughtful, she presently forgot Mrs. Touchett's observation. It was not because she had lost an admirer. Her imagination had traversed half Europe. It halted, panting, and even trembling a little, in the city of Rome. She figured herself announcing to her husband that Lord Warburton was to lead a bride to the altar, and she was of course not aware how extremely wan she must have looked while she made this intellectual effort. But at last she collected herself and said to her aunt, "He was sure to do it some time or other." Mrs. Touchett was silent. Then she gave a sharp little shake of the head. "Ah, my dear, you're beyond me!" she cried suddenly. They went on with their luncheon in silence. Isabel felt as if she had heard of Lord Warburton's death. She had known him only as a suitor, and now that was all over. He was dead for poor Pansy. By Pansy he might have lived. A servant had been hovering about. At last Mrs. Touchett requested him to leave them alone. She had finished her meal. She sat with her hands folded on the edge of the table. "I should like to ask you 3 questions," she observed when the servant had gone. "3 are a great many." "I can't do with less. I've been thinking. They're all very good ones." "That's what I'm afraid of. The best questions are the worst," Isabel answered. Mrs. Touchett had pushed back her chair, and as her niece left the table and walked, rather consciously, to one of the deep windows, she felt herself followed by her eyes. "Have you ever been sorry you didn't marry Lord Warburton?" Mrs. Touchett inquired. Isabel shook her head slowly, but not heavily. "No, dear aunt." "Good. I ought to tell you that I propose to believe what you say." "Your believing me's an immense temptation," she declared, smiling still. "A temptation to lie? I don't recommend you do that, for when I'm misinformed I'm as dangerous as a poisoned rat. I don't mean to crow over you." "It's my husband who doesn't get on with me," said Isabel. "I could have told him he wouldn't. I don't call that crowing over you," Mrs. Touchett added. "Do you still like Serena Merle?" she went on. "Not as I once did. But it doesn't matter, for she's going to America." "To America? She must have done something very bad." "Yes, very bad." "May I ask what it is?" "She made a convenience of me." "Ah!" cried Mrs. Touchett. "So she did of me. She does of every one." "She'll make a convenience of America," said Isabel, smiling again, and glad that her aunt's questions were over. It was not till the evening that she was able to see Ralph. He had been dozing all day; at least he had been lying unconscious. The doctor was there, but after a while went away, the local doctor who had attended his father and whom Ralph liked. He came 3 or 4 times a day. He was deeply interested in his patient. Ralph had had Sir Matthew Hope, but he had got tired of this celebrated man, to whom he had asked his mother to send word he was now dead and was therefore without further need of medical advice. Mrs. Touchett had simply written to Sir Matthew that her son disliked him. On the day of Isabel's arrival, Ralph gave no sign, as I have related, for many hours, but toward evening he raised himself and said he knew that she had come. How he knew was not apparent, inasmuch as for fear of exciting him no one had offered the information. Isabel came in and sat by his bed in the dim light. There was only a shaded candle in a corner of the room. She told the nurse she might go. She herself would sit with him for the rest of the evening. He had opened his eyes and recognized her, and had moved his hand, which lay helpless beside him, so that she might take it. But he was unable to speak. He closed his eyes again and remained perfectly still, only keeping her hand in his own. She sat with him a long time, till the nurse came back, but he gave no further sign. He might have passed away while she looked at him. He was already the figure and pattern of death. She had thought him far gone in Rome, and this was far worse. There was but one change possible now. There was a strange tranquillity in his face. It was as still as the lid of a box. With this he was a mere lattice of bones. When he opened his eyes to greet her, it was as if she were looking into immeasurable space. It was not till midnight that the nurse came back, but the hours to Isabel had not seemed long. It was exactly what she had come for. If she had come simply to wait, she found ample occasion, for he lay 3 days in a kind of grateful silence. He recognized her, and at moments seemed to wish to speak, but he found no voice. Then he closed his eyes again, as if he too were waiting for something that certainly would come. He was so absolutely quiet that it seemed to her what was coming had already arrived, and yet she never lost the sense that they were still together. But they were not always together. There were other hours that she passed in wandering through the empty house and listening for a voice that was not poor Ralph's. She had a constant fear. She thought it possible her husband would write to her. But he remained silent, and she only got a letter from Florence and from the Countess Gemini. Ralph, however, spoke at last, on the evening of the 3rd day. "I feel better to-night," he murmured abruptly, in the soundless dimness of her vigil. "I think I can say something." She sank upon her knees beside his pillow, took his thin hand in her own, begged him not to make an effort, not to tire himself. His face was of necessity serious. It was incapable of the muscular play of a smile, but its owner apparently had not lost a perception of incongruities. "What does it matter if I'm tired, when I've all eternity to rest? There's no harm in making an effort when it's the very last of all. Don't people always feel better just before the end? I've often thought of that. It's what I was waiting for. Ever since you've been here I thought it would come. I tried 2 or 3 times. I was afraid you'd get tired of sitting there." He spoke slowly, with painful breaks and long pauses. His voice seemed to come from a distance. When he ceased he lay with his face turned to Isabel, and his large unwinking eyes open into her own. "It was very good of you to come," he went on. "I thought you would, but I wasn't sure." "I wasn't sure either till I came," said Isabel. "You've been like an angel beside my bed. You know they talk about the angel of death. It's the most beautiful of all. You've been like that, as if you were waiting for me." "I was not waiting for your death. I was waiting for this. This is not death, dear Ralph." "Not for you, no. There's nothing makes us feel so much alive as to see others die. That's the sensation of life, the sense that we remain. I've had it, even I. But now I'm of no use but to give it to others. With me it's all over. and then he paused. Isabel bowed her head further till it rested on the two hands that were clasped upon his own. She couldn't see him now, but his far-away voice was close to her ear. "Isabel," he went on suddenly, "I wish it were over for you." She answered nothing. She had burst into sobs. She remained so with her buried face. He lay silent, listening to her sobs. At last he gave a long groan. "Ah, what is it you have done for me?" "What is it you did for me?" she cried, her now extreme agitation half smothered by her attitude. She had lost all her shame, all wish to hide things. Now he must know. She wished him to know, for it brought them supremely together, and he was beyond the reach of pain. "You did something once. You know it. Oh, Ralph, you've been everything. What have I done for you? What can I do to-day? I would die if you could live. But I don't wish you to live. I would die myself, not to lose you." Her voice was as broken as his own, and full of tears and anguish. "You won't lose me. You'll keep me. Keep me in your heart. I shall be nearer to you than I've ever been. Dear Isabel, life is better, for in life there's love. Death is good, but there's no love." "I never thanked you. I never spoke. I never was what I should be," Isabel went on. She felt a passionate need to cry out and accuse herself, to let her sorrow possess her. All her troubles for the moment became single and melted together into this present pain. "What must you have thought of me? Yet how could I know? I never knew, and I only know to-day because there are people less stupid than I." "Don't mind people," said Ralph. "I think I'm glad to leave people." She raised her head and her clasped hands. She seemed for a moment to pray for him. "Is it true? Is it true?" she asked. "True that you've been stupid? Oh, no," said Ralph, with a sensible intention of wit. "That you made me rich? That all I have is yours?" He turned away his head, and for some time said nothing. Then, at last, "Ah, don't speak of that. That was not happy." Slowly he moved his face toward her again, and they once more saw each other. But for that, and he paused. "I believe I ruined you," he wailed. She was full of the sense that he was beyond the reach of pain. He seemed already so little of this world. But even if she had not had it, she would still have spoken, for nothing mattered now but the only knowledge that was not pure anguish, the knowledge that they were looking at the truth together. "He married me for the money," she said. She wished to say everything. She was afraid he might die before she had done so. He gazed at her a little, and for the first time his fixed eyes lowered their lids. But he raised them in a moment, and then, "He was greatly in love with you," he answered. "Yes, he was in love with me, but he wouldn't have married me if I'd been poor. I don't hurt you in saying that. How can I? I only want you to understand. I always tried to keep you from understanding, but that's all over." "I always understood," said Ralph. "I thought you did, and I didn't like it. But now I like it." "You don't hurt me. You make me very happy." And as Ralph said this, there was an extraordinary gladness in his voice. She bent her head again and pressed her lips to the back of his hand. "I always understood," he continued, "though it was so strange, so pitiful. You wanted to look at life for yourself, but you were not allowed. You were punished for your wish. You were ground in the very mill of the conventional." "Oh, yes, I've been punished," Isabel sobbed. He listened to her a little, and then continued. "Was he very bad about your coming?" "He made it very hard for me, but I don't care." "It is all over between you?" "Oh, no, I don't think anything's over." "Are you going back to him?" Ralph gasped. "I don't know. I can't tell. I shall stay here as long as I may. I don't want to think. I needn't think. I don't care for anything but you, and that's enough for the present. It will last a little yet. Here on my knees, with you dying in my arms, I'm happier than I have been for a long time. And I want you to be happy, not to think of anything sad, only to feel that I'm near you and I love you. Why should there be pain? In such hours as this, what have we to do with pain? That's not the deepest thing. There's something deeper. Ralph evidently found from moment to moment greater difficulty in speaking. He had to wait longer to collect himself. At first he appeared to make no response to these last words. He let a long time elapse. Then he murmured simply, "You must stay here." "I should like to stay as long as seems right." "As seems right? As seems right?" He repeated her words. "Yes, you think a good deal about that." "Of course one must. You're very tired," said Isabel. "I'm very tired. You said just now that pain's not the deepest thing. No, no, but it's very deep. If I could stay—" "For me you'll always be here," she softly interrupted. It was easy to interrupt him. But he went on after a moment. "It passes. After all, it's passing now. But love remains. I don't know why we should suffer so much. Perhaps I shall find out. There are many things in life. You're very young." "I feel very old," said Isabel. "You'll grow young again. That's how I see you. I don't believe. But he stopped again. His strength failed him. She begged him to be quiet now. "We needn't speak to understand each other," she said. "I don't believe that such a generous mistake as yours can hurt you for more than a little." "Oh, Ralph, I'm very happy now," she cried through her tears. "And remember this," he continued, "that if you've been hated, you've also been loved. Ah, but Isabel, adored," he just audibly and lingeringly breathed. "Oh, my brother!" she cried, with a movement of still deeper prostration. Chapter 54